They thought he was weak because of his age. They thought his son was too scared to fight back. They laughed as the old rancher stood shaking, but silent on his own land. He had worked this soil his whole life and never asked anyone for mercy. That day, strangers crossed a line they did not understand. They pushed him down in front of his son and taught the boy what cruelty looks like. The son wanted to scream, but fear locked his voice. The old man felt pain in his bones, but a deeper pain in his heart. He did not beg, he did not curse. He only looked at his son with eyes full of promise. The men walked away believing the story was over. They believed fear had won. They never knew the past the rancher carried. They never knew who once owed him their life. And they never imagined that one broken man could awaken a force to change their fate. The old rancher lived a quiet life on a lonely stretch of land where the wind was his only companion. He woke before sunrise and worked until the sky turned dark. His hands were rough from years of honest labor, but his heart was gentle. He raised his young son with simple lessons about respect, patience, and dignity. The ranch was small, but it carried his entire world. Every fence he fixed and every animal he fed was done with care. He believed that hard work was enough to survive and kindness was enough to stay safe. Despite his age, he never complained and never asked for help. He trusted that peace could protect what little he had, that he avoided trouble and stayed away from conflict, choosing silence over fights. But deep inside, he carried old memories and unspoken strength. Unknown to the world, this quiet man had once crossed paths with powerful people. That peaceful life, however, was standing on the edge of a storm. He never expected the calm of the ranch shattered when dust rose on the horizon and unfamiliar voices cut through the wind. A group of ruthless men rode in, without warning, their eyes cold and their intentions clear. They spoke loudly as if the land already belonged to them and laughed at the silence that answered back. The old rancher stepped forward slowly, placing himself between the strangers and his home. His voice was steady when he asked them to leave, and his words carried no anger, only reason. That calm only fueled their cruelty. They mocked his age, mocked his worn clothes, and mocked the way he stood protectively near his son. The air grew heavy as fear settled over the land like a shadow. The boy felt his chest tighten, but his father did not move an inch. The men demanded ownership, claiming power was decided by strength, not fairness. They circled closer, testing how far they could push him. The rancher listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving theirs. He knew violence would change everything, yet surrender would destroy what he had built. They shoved him once, then again, trying to break his resolve. The sound echoed across the empty land and made the boy flinch. The rancher stayed upright, forcing himself to stand tall through the pain. He spoke again, asking for peace, but his words were drowned by laughter. One man kicked dirt at his feet, another stepped closer with a cruel smile. They wanted fear. They wanted submission. They wanted the son to see his father fall. The rancher felt anger rise, but he buried it deep, choosing control over rage. He remembered promises made long ago and lessons learned through sacrifice. The men grew impatient, mistaking restraint for weakness. They grabbed his shoulders and pushed him hard, making him stumble in front of his child. Time seemed to slow as the boy watched helplessly. The rancher caught himself breathing hard but refusing to kneel. The men argued among themselves over how far to go, testing the limits of their own cruelty. The wind carried the sound of their voices across the land, as if warning what was coming. The rancher felt blood trickle, but kept his eyes calm and focused. He knew this moment would define everything that followed. The men threatened to return with more force if he did not surrender the land. Their words were sharp, designed to leave scars deeper than bruises. They turned away, believing their message had been delivered, believing fear had already taken root. But as they rode off, the rancher remained standing, his body aching yet unbroken. He placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, grounding him in that moment. The land fell quiet again, but the silence was no longer peaceful. It was tense, charged, and waiting. The rancher looked across the open field, knowing the storm had begun and that survival would demand more than endurance. This was no longer about land alone. It was about dignity, protection, and a line that once crossed could never be erased. The sound of hooves returned sooner than expected, and before the dust could settle, the men were back, moving faster, louder, and filled with intent. They did not speak this time. They surrounded the rancher, cutting off every path as his son stood frozen nearby. The first blow came without warning, knocking the breath from his chest and sending him backward. The boy cried out, but fear held his feet in place. The rancher tried to stand, but another strike followed, heavier and crueler, forcing him down. The men shouted insults meant to strip away dignity as much as strength. They wanted the land, but more than that, they wanted control. They dragged him across the dirt, making sure his son could see every moment. The boy felt his heart break as he watched his father struggle to rise again and again, only to be pushed back down. The rancher tasted dust and pain but refused to scream. He locked his eyes on his son, silently telling him to stay strong. That silent message hurt the men more than words, so they hit harder, laughing as if cruelty were a game. The rancher's body weakened, yet his spirit held firm. He fell to his knees, then to the ground, as the world spun around him. The boy dropped beside him, begging them to stop, but his voice was swallowed by their laughter. The men mocked the tears, calling them proof of victory. They believed fear had crushed resistance, and that humiliation would end all hope. The rancher lay still for a moment, gathering what little strength remained, as he reached out, touching his son's hand, grounding himself in that connection. That simple act enraged the attackers, who kicked dirt over them as a final insult. They stepped back, satisfied, convinced the lesson was complete. Their laughter echoed as they turned away, already speaking of the land as theirs. The boy knelt, shaking, holding his father, who struggled to breathe. The rancher opened his eyes slowly, meeting his son's gaze filled with pain, but also resolve. He whispered nothing, yet his expression carried a promise deeper than words. The men rode off, confident and careless, never looking back. The land grew quiet again, broken only by the boy's sobs and the wind passing through the fence. The rancher lay bruised and broken, yet alive. He felt shame, not for himself, but for what his son had been forced to witness. He knew this moment would stay with the boy forever unless something changed. With great effort, he pushed himself upright, leaning on his son for support. Every movement sent pain through his body, but his mind was clear. This was the moment peace had ended and purpose had begun, that he understood that survival now demanded action rooted in memory and honor. The men believed they had won because they saw only weakness. They never saw the strength built through years of sacrifice. They never knew that mercy once given could return as protection multiplied. They left behind a broken body but awakened a past that would soon rise far greater than they imagined. Night settled slowly over the ranch as silence replaced the chaos, and the stars watched without judgment. The rancher lay inside his small home, his body aching with every breath, while his son sat close, afraid to let go. The boy's eyes were red from crying and filled with questions he was too scared to ask. The rancher reached out and held his son's hand firmly, letting that connection speak where words failed. He saw guilt in the boy's face and pain that should never belong to a child. That sight hurt him more than any blow he had taken. He pulled his son closer and rested his forehead against his, knowing this moment would shape the rest of their lives. He wanted to promise safety, but he chose truth instead. He told his son that fear was natural, but surrender was not. The boy listened quietly, holding on to every word as if they were armor. The rancher spoke slowly, reminding him that dignity could survive even the darkest moments. As the fire crackled softly, the rancher closed his eyes and searched his memories. He thought of choices made long ago and people whose lives had crossed his path. He remembered a moment when he had helped a stranger without expecting anything in return. That memory burned brighter, now carrying new meaning. He realized kindness never disappears, it only waits for the right time to return. The rancher opened his eyes and looked at his son with steady resolve. He did not speak of revenge or anger. He spoke of balance and justice, and standing tall even when the world tries to push you down. In that quiet room, a promise was formed without sound. He would not let this cruelty define their future. He would not allow fear to become his son's inheritance. The boy felt the shift, sensing strength returning where weakness once lay. He leaned against his father, finding comfort in that calm certainty. Outside, the wind moved across the land, carrying whispers of what was coming. The rancher stared into the darkness beyond the window, knowing the men believed the story had ended. He understood that patience was now his greatest weapon. He planned carefully, measuring each breath against the weight of responsibility. His body needed time to heal, but his mind was already moving forward. He knew where to go and who to seek when dawn arrived. That knowledge brought peace to his tired heart. The night stretched on, but sleep never fully came. When morning finally approached, the rancher stood slowly, feeling pain remind him of the cost already paid. He placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, grounding both of them in that moment. This land was more than soil and fences. It was a promise passed from father to son. He whispered softly that some debts were not paid with money, but with honor. The boy nodded, not fully understanding but trusting completely. As the first light touched the horizon, the rancher stepped outside, breathing deeply. This injustice would not fade into silence. That would be answered with purpose, shaped by memory, loyalty, and respect. The men had taken his peace, but awakened something far stronger and far older that would soon walk beside him again. The rancher walked beyond the edge of his land as the morning light grew stronger, guiding his steps toward a place few remembered. That he moved with care, listening to the rhythm of the earth beneath his boots, letting memory lead where pain could not slow him. Years ago, on a different road, he had found a wounded man alone and bleeding from a conflict that was not his own. He had chosen compassion over fear, lifting that stranger onto his horse and carrying him to safety without asking a name or reward. That man had been an Apache chief traveling between tribes burdened by danger. The rancher had stayed through the night, tending wounds, sharing water, and offering shelter until strength returned. They spoke little, yet respect formed in silence. When the chief left at dawn, he placed a mark into the dirt, a sign of life owed and honor shared. The rancher never told anyone because kindness for him was never meant to be traded. That memory now guided him across open ground toward distant hills where smoke once rose in peace. He reached a familiar marker carved into stone and paused, letting the wind carry his presence forward. He waited without calling out, trusting patience as he always had. Hours passed before movement appeared, figures emerging quietly, watching from a distance. The rancher stood still, showing no threat, only resolve. When the Apache scouts approached, recognition passed through their eyes, and they nodded, leading him onward. He followed into a camp alive with watchful calm, where elders gathered beneath open sky. The chief stepped forward, older now, yet strong and clear-eyed. He looked at the rancher, seeing time written across his face, and understood without explanation. The rancher spoke, simply describing injustice suffered and fear placed upon his child. He did not ask for violence. He asked for balance and protection so his son could grow without terror. The chief listened in silence, remembering a night when mercy had saved his life. He answered with words heavy with meaning, saying, "Debts of honor never fade." The tribe gathered, hearing the story passed among them for years of a man who helped without reason. They understood this moment was not about land but respect and promise. The chief raised his hand, signaling unity and purpose. That he declared that when kindness is shown, it becomes a bond stronger than blood. The rancher felt weight lift from his chest, knowing he was not alone. The chief ordered messengers to travel, calling warriors from every direction, not for war, but presence and warning. The camp stirred with quiet urgency, preparations forming with discipline and restraint. The rancher watched, humbled by the response his simple act had earned. He realized the past never truly leaves, it waits until needed. As the son lowered, the chief placed a hand on the rancher's shoulder, assuring him that his child would not stand unguarded again. The rancher bowed his head, accepting not power but partnership. When night approached, fires lit across the camp, reflecting determination rather than anger. He knew the men who caused harm believed strength was loud and cruel. They would soon learn another truth, that honor walks with many and answers when called. This alliance, born from mercy, would now move as one, carrying a message no words alone could deliver. Dawn broke with a low rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself as the horizon darkened with moving figures. The rancher stood beside his son, feeling the ground vibrate beneath their feet, while a quiet force advanced without haste. From the hills and open plains, Apache warriors emerged in perfect order, their numbers growing with every breath until the land itself appeared to stand with them. They moved without shouting, without chaos, guided by discipline shaped through generations. The air changed, heavy with authority rather than threat. The rancher felt his son grip his hand tighter, not in fear, but awe, as the line of warriors formed a wide arc around the ranch. The sun climbed higher, revealing faces calm, focused, and unafraid. The chief rode forward, stopping beside the rancher, acknowledging him with a steady nod that carried respect deeper than words. The men who once rode in laughing returned, expecting silence and submission. but instead found themselves facing a wall of presence they could not ignore. Their confidence drained as quickly as it had come. They slowed, unsure of how to react as hundreds of eyes watched them, without hostility, yet without mercy. The land they claimed suddenly felt smaller. The rancher did not step back or forward. He remained still, letting truth speak through what stood behind him. The chief raised his hand, and the warriors stopped in unison, a single motion shared by many. The silence that followed was louder than any threat. The men glanced at one another, realizing escape was no longer certain. They tried to speak, but their voices failed beneath the weight of what surrounded them. The chief addressed them calmly, stating that this land was under protection earned through honor and debt fulfilled. He explained that harm done to one under their watch would not be forgotten, nor repeated. The words were measured, carrying certainty rather than rage. The rancher watched as fear replaced arrogance in the eyes of those who had mocked him. They understood now that power did not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrived quietly and stayed. The chief made it clear that no blood was demanded, only respect, boundaries, and an end to harassment. The men nodded, quickly agreeing to terms they could no longer challenge. They backed away slowly, careful not to turn their backs until distance allowed breath to return. The warriors remained still until the threat disappeared beyond the horizon. Then the chief lowered his hand, and the tension eased like a held breath released. The rancher felt emotion rise unexpectedly, gratitude mixed with relief and humility. He looked down at his son, who stared wide-eyed, understanding that protection could come from kindness given long ago. The warriors stood a moment longer, imprinting the lesson into the land before dispersing with the same calm they had arrived. The chief turned to the rancher, reminding him that honor travels far and returns when least expected. He told the boy that courage is not measured by fists, but by choices made when no one is watching. The rancher thanked him, simply knowing words could never match the gift received. As the warriors faded into the distance, the ranch returned to silence, but it was no longer fragile. It was guarded by memory, promise, and respect. The ground stopped trembling, yet the message remained clear. This land was no longer alone and never would be again. The rancher watched the dust settle as silence returned, stronger than before. He did not feel victory in anger, but peace in knowing his son was safe. He never asked for revenge, because blood could never heal what fear had tried to break. He asked only for respect, so his child could grow without shadows following him. Justice arrived quietly, carried by honor instead of violence. From that day, the land stood untouched, not because of threats, but because of promise. The ranch became a place people passed with care and remembered with respect. The boy grew stronger, learning that true power comes from mercy given at the right moment. The rancher aged, but his spirit rested, knowing his choice changed their future forever. Years later, when the wind crossed the fields, it carried a story not of pain, but of dignity. One cruel act had tried to destroy a family, but one kind act built a legacy that time could never erase.